I'm going to interview Roan today to basically get some general idea of his methodologies and techniques into practicing socionics, to understand where your concepts disagree with popular socionics, to understand where your views were shaped, and what your objectives are in the socionics community in general. You have anything to say to that?
What do you mean by popular socionics views?
Well, basically, I mean, it can mean a lot of things, but like in general, you kind of get a popular, I mean, you get a lot of people who don't actually understand socionics, and they...
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, all right, I'm just going to start with the top of the list. These aren't actually like in order, but have you ever seen Model G from Motogolenko?
I'm vaguely familiar with it. I'm not an expert on what it actually posits. It's not really very interested in it.
Yeah. All right. I didn't think that you were. All right. Okay. So where does intertype relations fit in with your understandings of socionics? If that question's too general, we can get into that after we ask some other questions.
That is a very general question. I would say that the way I see socionics is that intertype relations. So in Augustus socionics, intertype relations are one of the biggest parts of glue that holds the theory together. And the way I view it is that these are much looser than Augusta envisioned them. That is to say, she has very specific ideas of the way that specific relations work, most notably in duality, about which a ton has been written in the early days of socionics, but also in other relations, like you have very specific ideas about what illusion relations or benefit relations mean, all of which I think are rather tenuous. The way that I see it is that at best these are very loose descriptions, and mostly they're descriptions that reduce conceptually to quadra values, such that the benefit is a prime example because there are actually 8 different types of benefit relations depending on which quadra is the benefactor and which quadra is the beneficiary, and these are extremely different depending on what quadras the individual participants in the relationship are in. I don't think that they're at all similar depending on these views, and yeah.
Yeah, I've noticed that. I know what you're talking about. It's really dependent on the 2 types that are involved in that. So you're saying it goes further than that and is really dependent on quadra values and not necessarily the type, the individual type.
Yeah, I think especially I think that the quadra values is a basic framework for how Augusta's relations are structured, and that the most basic things that you can say are that duality is predicted to be a good relationship between people, as are the other same quadra relations, and the opposing quadras are predicted to be relationships of misunderstanding. And so those are somewhat clear predictions. In the adjacent quadra relations, I think it's much less clear. And these are especially, it's true in the other predictions, but these are especially where combinations of different quadras can be seen. There are literally combinatorically more combinations of possible adjacent quadras than possible opposing quadras. And so I think that in those situations, the quadra values of the individuals dominate.
So you said there are more possible adjacent quadra values than there are conflicting quadra values? that what you said?
Right. There are two pairs of conflicting quadras, and there are 4 pairs of possible adjacent quadras.
Okay. Maybe we can get into that in a little bit.
Okay.
So you said there are 4 possible adjacent quadra values. Am I reiterating that properly?
Yeah, they're alpha and beta are adjacent quadras. Another set of adjacent quadras is beta and gamma and delta and alpha. Those are 4. That's all I'm saying.
All right. My cat's acting crazy if you hear that.
No worries.
Okay, so these next questions have to do with Model A. Okay. Augusta's model. Do you have views that differ from Augusta's model?
I do, but by and large, my view of Model A is largely the same as Augusta's Model A. The most clear difference between the way that I see Socionics and Augusta's version of Model A is in the vulnerable function, which Augusta very clearly describes as a painful function, as something that is a source of painful criticism for the individual. And I don't see it that way. I don't think that it's a painful spot, but a blind spot.
Yeah, we've seen that view a little bit talked about here and there in World Socionic Society. Actually, we had a little chat about it today. I think it was Joseph Cox that asked the question if polar was more annoying or demonstrative. And a lot of people said polar, but I think in the Socionics community, it's like, well, you know the polar exists now, whereas before you really didn't. But, okay, so your view is that the polar is a blind spot. Say for you, Fe polar is not necessarily something that is going to bother you really bad. It's more like you're not going to really notice that it's a thing. Say like you're talking to an ESE and they are attempting to like mobilize you and attempting to say give you positive emotions or positive reactions.
Well, first of all, that depends on my it implicitly assumes my typing.
Oh, right.
I wouldn't usually do in purposes of discussion, but so let's just roll with it. I would say that in a situation of this type where somebody was giving me a lot of positive reinforcement or something like this, well, personally, I've always been very uncomfortable with positive emotionality, which might sound like it's a little bit of a strange thing. I would say that it probably in situations like this, I would just not really react very much.
In general, can you describe it as a blind spot for Fe polar and not necessarily yourself?
What do you mean? What does Fe vulnerable look like?
Yes. Whereas the popular opinion is, like you said, an area of like, I don't really know. Can you possibly describe how your views differ than how most people explain the vulnerable, using emotions or Fe as an example?
Okay. Well, there's a popular concept of a POLR hit, which essentially means this: when somebody criticizes you about the use of the vulnerable function. So as particularly in a context where you weren't aware of its use. So an example, for instance, is suppose you have an Fe vulnerable person who is not paying attention to the emotional atmosphere and is saying things that are appear blunt or insensitive, perhaps unknowingly. And someone else could come and criticize them and say, you are saying things that are insensitive. You should not do that and say things that are more sensitive instead. For which there are a lot of possible reactions. One, I think that the popular reaction of what is a POLR hit often has to do with being blindsided by that type of information. There's something you weren't aware of at all, and somebody else comes in and says, hey, you should really be more sensitive, you're being a jerk. And that's distressing, not because you think they're right, but because it causes interpersonal tension, and you're unable to understand really in a full way what is the source of the interpersonal tension. It's just there, and it's sort of you were blindsided, and in some way it's still in the blind spot. And one way that I think this happens is that some types are more affected by this than others. So since you pointed out my type specifically, I'll just go with this and say that often in this type of situation, I would say, like, no, that person that I'm being insensitive to fully deserves the kind of treatment that I like. I didn't do anything wrong. I just told them the truth. I told them my feelings, and now the air is completely cleared. I don't see a reason why I should have been sugarcoating the things that I told them or saying them in a more sensitive way. I wasn't being a jerk. I was just being forthright about saying it, and I'm not interested in hearing you say that I should have been saying these things in a more sensitive way.
Right. Do you think there's a tendency? Yeah, go ahead.
I think for some types, this is a type-related thing, right? You can imagine that some types, the fact that somebody is generating interpersonal tension by imposing an expectation that is in their blind spot upon them is more distressing than for other types, which you can see perhaps in that particular example.
Do you think there's a tendency to specifically, because you don't understand it, try to process it with an adjacent type of information, like a specific set of information elements, as a way to compensate for that?
What exactly do you mean? Could you give an example?
Yeah, let's say
Even a hypothetical example.
Yeah, let's say someone criticizes you for not being emotionally sensitive, or any ILI, or an SLI, for example. And there's no way to really process that information. So is there like a specific block of information that you would say is within Model A that tries to take control of processing that and kind of metabolizes that, and instead of using say E or FE, would you say that, say, an ILI would try to process that with FI or TI or NI and TE?
So what I would say is this, that the way that, as in this example of somebody, of a putative FE vulnerable person being insensitive and failing to sugarcoat their words, there's an orientation not to actually respect the issue of being insensitive, but instead to rely on the valued element in contrast. So in this case, it's FI, and instead of there's a belief, I guess, that the idea of being insensitive at the expense of forthrightly conveying one's feelings is the wrong, it's just the wrong thing. Maybe being able to convey one's feelings is can be seen as important in some sense, but the way that the part about the vulnerable function, I think, is seen as not important. Even when other people criticize you for it, you might understand that your behavior is wrong, but you really don't accept the reasons that are given if they have to do with the vulnerable function. Instead, you see the vulnerable function is not important. Here's the mobilizing function instead. This is what's actually important. And I justify my behavior thus. My behavior is in accordance with what are reasonable standards of conduct for the mobilizing function, and you're still wrong.
Right.
And I think that this is not everyone is going to say you're wrong in this type of situation, because it is a source of interpersonal tension, which is painful regardless of who you are. I would say it's painful for types with vulnerable ethics as well. Just the fact of being in a situation with interpersonal tension.
Yeah.
But I think that whether or not that people verbalize you're wrong when somebody says you should be using the vulnerable function in some other way, internally in their model of the psyche in Model A, the blind spot says you are wrong, and that can be manifest in a variety of ways. Such as, for instance, avoidance would be another possible way of manifesting that would be in some types that are less characteristically blunt.
Okay. So your views are widely similar with Model A. Is that a correct? Okay. Is there anything specific within Model A that you, aside from quadra values and say inter-type relations, is there any specific guidelines that Model A uses that you would say might not be actually correct structures for the psyche?
My answer to that question is no. The only issue that I have with Model A is in the vulnerable function, which is one of really the two things that I disagree with Auguste about. I disagree with the vulnerable function most clearly, and also I have this. We talked about this earlier. Is this specific idea of that intertype relations are meaningful, that benefit relations, illusion relations, business relations, these adjacent quadra relations are meaningful, which I don't really think is true.
What do you mean by meaningful?
You may. I think they're really just quadra values.
Okay.
Those are the things that the 2 points that I somewhat clearly disagree with Augusta about. Now, you asked about Model A. Are there some constructs in Model A that I don't think are right? Mm-hmm. Well, for instance, there are a lot of ways of interpreting Model A. If you talk to lots of different people, they have different ways of interpreting Model A. I consider everything else in Model A the way I see Model A, and I've written about it in various places, basically consistent with what Augusta wrote, but she also had other things like for instance, the blocks in Model A, the 4 blocks, which are ego, superid, and the id block. And there were some people use dichotomies to describe the nature of these blocks. And if you talk to Jack is the only person that actually does this that I've really ever seen, but he uses an extensive set of dichotomies to describe the function positions in Model A as well, for which he often seems to come to the same conclusions, even though I'm not interested in these dichotomies at all. Right, so the functions within an individual block are often quite different, depending on the nature of the block. This is especially true in the superego and id blocks, where you have a partly valued function, let's say, like the role function, and a completely unvalued function, like the vulnerable function and the ignoring function, which is arguable. But yeah, so like those are are tools to help guide people in Model A, and mostly I don't think too much of them. I mostly am interested in characterizing how the individual function positions work in Model A, which are all quite unique.
Okay. So, I don't remember which block it is that has the vulnerable function and the role function, but
The superego block.
Superego. So what you're saying is, although they're blocked together, they don't really work in the same ways.
I don't think so, no.
Yeah.
And I mean, also, if you look at descriptions of Model A, Augusta's descriptions of Model A, they're quite different functions, right? So
Yeah.
Augusta describes the vulnerable function as a point of painful criticism that's deeply unvalued. Obviously, I don't think it's a point of painful criticism. But the role function she describes as something which is used, but for which seems to mislead the individual. I like to think of it as in the true sense of the term superego, as it's used in conventionally that Freud developed it. I think that the role function is a true superego of the psyche, something that is a focus of conscious attention.
Yeah, but partially valued is
valued, always there, but somehow never going away, not quite right in some ways. But I think of it as partial valued, and that's not really right. There are other ways in which it's not a valued function, but that's the way I conceptualize it.
Yeah, that's interesting. That topic could really go so far. Like, you could start talking about how each person's role function interacts with other stuff, how it receives information, how it wants to categorize things. But we won't talk about that right now. Let's see here. Okay, how long have you been in the Socionics community?
So I first heard of Socionics in 2005. And for a while, I've been in the Socionics community, I guess, since sometime in 2006. And have gone as a more and less active participant since that time, as various things have happened. But for the first probably at least 2 years that I knew of Socionics, I was mostly just exploring it myself. I don't think that I fully understood it at that time. So yeah, does that answer the question?
Yeah. So for the first 2 years, you were basically just figuring out how Socionics works within your own psyche, basically. Okay, so did you spend quite a bit of time, because I know you didn't really start World Socionics Society lurking until probably the past year or a year and a half?
It's only about more than a year old, a little more than a year old now.
Okay. So you spent a lot of time on the forums. I haven't myself, so I wouldn't know.
Yeah.
Okay.
Train.
Sorry about that. Okay, so yeah, so most of the time that you learned about Socionics has been through the forums. Did you practice in real life after that first 2 years, or how did that go?
What does that mean? What does it mean to practice it in real life?
Well, I mean, I guess that could really mean different things for different people.
It could. What do you mean by it?
What I mean by that is try to basically acknowledge psyches of other people and see how yours works with theirs, and kind of try to get a feel for Model A in real life. Like, you know what I mean?
No, not entirely. But I can still try and answer some of the question to the extent I understood it, which is that I didn't go around consciously. I've actually heard some people doing this, which I kind of find a little bit startling. I didn't go around consciously deciding I was going to learn about Socionics now.
Okay.
As I sort of most everything that I went. I just lived my life as it was. I was a high school student at the time, and then I went to college. And sometimes I would have socionics insights just because I was thinking about it. But otherwise, I didn't always apply socionics to everything that I did or every one of my interactions. It was mostly a thing that existed in my head, which I thought about sometimes. And I would say that that is what, the way I see socionics, that is what it is. It's a tool for understanding. And certainly not something like a tool for social change. That doesn't really make much sense. And in the way I was doing it, I was understanding in a very selfish way, not even in the sense like, here's a difficult person. I don't really understand this person. How can I better understand this by using this tool? I wasn't really thinking about it in that sense, most of the time at least. I was mostly thinking about it in, hey, this is interesting. What does this model predict about this person? It's kind of interesting the way that this person acts. And I think that gave me, eventually doing that over a long period of time. At first, for instance, what this did was gave me a way of thinking about people that I didn't have before, which I think is very valuable in itself, although, as we can see, has the potential to be misused, but that's another matter entirely. It can be a thing that's very valuable in and of itself. And yeah, I feel that eventually that gave me greater insight into the way that people function in general. But I wasn't expecting to gain that when I was thinking about socionics. I was just thinking about it as a thing that I thought about sometimes.
Okay. So, so basically you learned about socionics. It was more of a mental thing before it really became applied to people.
I guess you could say that, but what does it mean to be applied to people?
I would say that you would have, we'll get into this a little bit later, but you would have like a mental model that you, I guess you really could, I don't know actually how to, I think this is like the intuitive sensing divide. Like I really can't, I don't know anything about socionics past exactly what I experience in real life. But we can skip this question for now because I think
What's the question?
I don't remember.
Okay. Yeah, that settles it.
All right. Okay. So throughout the time that you were practicing socionics, within the past 10 years,
10 years.
Did you find sources of information that you thought were more reliable and that were not reliable at all?
I found many sources of information that I felt were not reliable at all.
Yeah.
I would say that the three people who are most influential at formulating my view of socionics were Augusta's writing, and mostly even not Augusta's writing, but what I felt that she was trying to say. And then Rick DeLong and expat, who is Peter Bartle. So for those that don't know, Rick DeLong is an American guy who grew up as a Mormon, and as a Mormon has to do required missionary service. Which he did I'm pretty sure he did it in the Ukraine. And while he was living in the Ukraine, encountered socionics and studied with various people in Ukraine for a long time, and as the forums for Socionics were became to be a thing in the mid 2000s, he became for a couple of years very active and trying to help people understand what this was. And I always felt like the stuff he had to say made a lot of sense. And a lot of the methodology he uses, particularly focusing very finely on observations rather than diagnoses, come from his influence. And then Peter Bartle, who you know.
Yes, I know Peter Bartle, sort of.
Sort of, well.
Okay. Okay. I get the impression that there are a few Russian socionists that you don't particularly put much faith in. Would you like to get into that? Do you know what I'm talking about?
No, I don't.
Okay. How do you feel about Galenko?
Well, Viktor Goyenko has a variety of hypotheses that are not at all like Augustus Socionics.
Okay.
Very, very little that Viktor Goyenko says has anything to do with Augustus Socionics, and it doesn't interest me.
Okay. So it's not necessarily, maybe partially is that you didn't really see it applicable, but in general you just are disinterested in his hypotheses.
It is not a stretch. I have very precise language to discuss this, right? This is what not interested means. I'm not interested in them. You can be not interested in things for a variety of reasons. I could also say some other things, which I think would be true, which are not how I would usually talk about it in public, which is that Viktor Goyenko is completely stupid. He doesn't have a fucking clue what he's talking about. But I mean, whatever.
All right. We will leave it at that.
And like I don't know if are you only interested in Viktor Goyenko? Because
No.
this is why I said I don't know what you're talking about, because you could be referring to any number of people.
Yeah, I haven't been in the community long enough to really even remember most of the names of the more popular socionists. So really,
I certainly don't know all the names of all the socionists that exist, but
well, I don't even know a handful.
If you ask some of them, I know of some of their work, or some of them.
Okay. Okay, so if you were to recommend, who would you recommend for people who are learning socionics? Who would you recommend? Of course, Augusta. Who else do you think is, or do you know of anyone that you would recommend newcomers to socionics to familiarize themselves with writings and theories or whatever?
You mean in the traditional literature, or you mean in the Western literature that we've been creating since 2003 or 2004?
Yeah, traditional and Western. As far as I can tell, 16 Types and Wikisocion is really the only two sources that I know of.
Okay, well, another source to add to that is Rick DeLong's blog, which is the Socionist.blogspot, now the ex-Socionist.blogspot, and also his old site, which used to be Socionics.us, and I think they changed the domain name because I don't know, maybe it's still there. All of which are a very different sort of. It's a more conceptual treatment of Socionics, which I found very valuable as I was learning it. I think that there's not really a lot of literature in the Eastern tradition that is necessary, including Augusta's works even. I think Augusta's works are interesting. It's interesting to see what she was thinking about, but most of the literature that followed that, I think, is not that interesting. And there are some exceptions. Like if you look at, there's a high degree of variability in the degree of faithfulness of the works that followed and descriptions that people wrote to the characters that Augusta actually described, and especially to the quadras that Augusta described. And for somebody that doesn't speak Russian or Ukrainian, it's certainly not necessary to delve into that literature, I think, to understand things well. Obviously, I have my site, which is it's sort of all over the place, but currently is hosted at techhouse.org, which I think is pretty good writing. What's that?
Is that the blog where you have videos and then you're typing?
Oh, yeah. It's Socion by Example, blogspot. If you search Socion by Example in Google, you'll find it.
Right.
But that's a different kind of thing. I think it's helpful. It's helpful in a different kind of way. And other than that, I think that I think nearly everyone that is becoming a better socionist does so in some form or another through community interaction. I think it's not strictly necessary. That is to say, occasionally I get people, I talk with people who just read the works of Augusta, and usually we disagree on a lot of things, but we agree on a surprising amount of what is actually, I think, fundamental in socionics. But that's much more rare. And a lot of people do try and sort of, there are some advantages to community interaction, which is that they often tend to be filled with a lot of drama, which is not necessarily a good thing, but you can look at that drama and try and understand what's going on. And it often becomes complicated, but sometimes there are people to guide and explain what's going on, and sometimes there are not. And in any case, it has the potential, I think, of being helpful. Although I've seen many people, many people, in my view, look for that guidance and fail to find it.
Yeah, definitely. I don't really have much to say to that. It's just that, well, we know that it's not really common for most people to agree on almost anything, even people that really know what they're doing when it comes to typing, which is odd.
Why is it odd?
Well, because it seems like there are levels of mastery in socionics, and you don't ever see like the best. Like there's nobody that's like right 70% of the time. I'm
not sure. Well,
just in general.
That is something I don't want to comment. I don't want to comment on that too publicly.
Yeah, that's fine. Let's move on to the next question, unless you have something to add to that.
Sure.
Okay. So you've basically already answered the question about your socionic studies, like who shaped your views, which basically was you. You just had supplemented with the people that you named above, which were Peter Bartle, Augusta, and Rick DeLong. All right. Do you have a specific methodology for typing?
No.
No. Okay. Do you have a personal model
What does that mean?
That means basically what I just asked you with your methodology is like, okay, so let's say you take a person, I don't want to use anybody's names that we know, but Susie's video, and you you watch it, and you like, what is the first things that you look for when you're typing someone?
What are the first things that I look for?
Does it have anything to do with like ego blocks and quadra values?
No, I think that the way I would answer that is I try and look at what they're saying. I try and make observations about that person. What are some things that they said that seem distinctive? What are things that they said that other people wouldn't say? Maybe they said something that's very unusual. Can I imagine how another person that I know would think about that particular thing that they said? What are interesting, distinctive observations or things about what they said that show that they might see the world in a particular way? That's what I look for, and that's not very specific, I know.
Okay.
Does that answer that question? I don't know.
It does, sort of, but not necessarily. What I got from that was that you try to pay more attention to what a person, things that stand out in a person's personality. How would you say you remove all the clutter, like the difference between what someone's presenting and what's actually going on?
That's a very, very difficult thing to do in general.
Yeah.
I'm glad you asked the question because it's a really important issue. And you know, I've said this before in some venues. I think that the answer to that question is that experience thinking about similar types of people plays an enormous role, which is to say that you see somebody who is in some way not telling you the whole story about what they're doing, what they're thinking, and you absent understanding exactly why they're doing that, you would just take them at face value and say, oh, okay, that person says this. And it's over time that you'll realize that that person doesn't actually mean that. They mean something else. If you continue interacting with them, you'll see that you may come to see that they don't really mean that at all. And so how do you generalize that? Well, it's very difficult. I think the way that generalizes is in looking at a lot of different people, trying to understand the strategies that people usually use, especially the way that they prefer to see themselves. Right? So imagine that when people say something and mean something different, very often I think that what's really going on is that they're being deceptive in some sense. And so when they're being deceptive, they could either be knowledgeably saying, okay, I know I am this way, but I'm going to say this other thing instead. And then they say it. But what does a person have to gain from that? Basically nothing. I think that that's very rare that we would actually see that. Instead, I think that sometimes people do not always see themselves clearly. They see themselves in a particular way. They have a particular self-concept that they would like to live up to, that colors their view of how they see themselves. And more than anything, if they make, so for instance, a type video or do an interview, and then they say some things about themselves, they're acting in accordance with the way that they would like to see themselves. They're being deceptive towards themselves rather than being deceptive towards the audience or the interviewer.
Yeah, I think that makes plenty of sense.
The way in which they're being deceptive towards themselves, if you want to try and understand that dynamic, I mean, Socionics offers, if you read descriptions about Socionics, you read descriptions about things like the Enneagram, other personality models, you might get some clues as to ways in which this commonly happens, but they can be very tricky. I think that it's, there's no substitute that I know of for having the experience of talking to those people and then misunderstanding them and coming to understand what they were really doing over a long period of time. And then if you do that, you can start to see more quickly what are clues that show you that people are behaving in a way that is different from what they're giving off. But that's very tricky. I don't think that that's easy at all.
Okay. Yeah, that pretty much answers my question, which what I got out of that was it takes a lot of time to understand people.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay. You may not feel comfortable answering this one, but whose theories do you completely reject? We got Galenko already. Is there anyone else that you would say that you are completely disinterested in learning?
Oh, there's tons. I don't think I can give you a full list.
Would it be better to? Well, you already answered the other question, which was who you would recommend, I guess.
Sure.
So your specific recommendation was interacting in the actual Socionics community, basically.
No, I hesitate to give that recommendation because, as you know, the Socionics community is filled with jerks. I specifically would recommend doing it like on World Socionics Society and not on 16 Types,
right?
Which is simply a higher ratio of jerks to non-jerks. But I think it is potentially valuable, at least. So like I would say it, I guess, in this way, is that personally, I don't feel like I would be at the place that I am if I hadn't spent a lot of time interacting at 16 Types. But I don't go back there anymore. I don't think I've posted there since like, what, 2010? Something like that? So, I mean, there's two sides to that coin.
Okay. Yeah, there's a definite political split between certain communities, which I'm not personally interested in. It's kind of beside the point, basically.
It's totally beside the point. That has nothing to do with Socionics.
Yeah.
All of these disputes, this is like, I teach a little class on Socionics, not like a serious class, but like a 2-hour session. And I say, people sometimes ask these kinds of questions. These are for people who are totally naive to Socionics. But there's so much that you could say about talking about Socionists, which is part of what we're doing here, which has nothing to do with Socionics. All of the infighting about talking about Socionics, talking about different Socionists and how stupid they are and other things has nothing to do with understanding Socionics.
Yep, it's pretty, I don't know, banal, I guess that's the word. I don't even know how to pronounce that, but yeah.
You pronounced it correctly.
Do you have any objectives within the Socionics community other than just attempting to teach other people what you know?
I mean, I have some long-term research goals. Socionics makes a prediction about interpersonal compatibility at close psychological distance. That prediction can be tested if you get a situation of close psychological distance, I think it would be cool to test that prediction. And this is, for instance, what the Kickstarter campaign was trying to do, is raise money to start to build a test that we think is actually good enough to test that prediction. Or at least this is sort of part of the long-term plan that I have. And we didn't get that money, but we're examining less optimal ways of collecting some data to build that test. So that, I would say that that's something that I intend to keep thinking about doing. Other than that's the only thing that I would say, though.
Okay.
I'm here. The other main reason, which is what you said, is to help people on their spiritual development in understanding socionics as part of a path of spiritual development that people may or may not be cognizant of.
Okay. Yeah, understood. I'm just withholding my own comments about basically all this stuff, so.
It's fine.
Okay, so you do plan to stay within the Socionics community long-term, as you see fit.
As I see, well, I mean, as I see fit, sure. Yes, that's basically right.
Okay. All right. I guess this would be the last question, unless you have anything to add, and that is, if you could possibly elaborate on what you would emphasize when it comes to Model A, intertype relations, and quadra values.
What do you mean? What do I emphasize?
What would you emphasize? Okay. Let me see if I can put this in a better way. What do you know, or what knowledge would you put forth about how quadra values work that you think is not widely understood or known? I can give you an example, which is,
okay.
Within the quadra you have two purported types that act similarly and two that may not. So they like mirrors are SEE and ESI, which don't necessarily function the same compared to SEE and LIE.
Right.
Yeah. So the expressions of the similar or same IMEs, that's, so far I've gathered that, but I don't necessarily know the details of how you would say it.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree with that. So there's this point that the closest types to each other are activators. So you have the SE and the LIE. These are the closest. These two types are closer to each other in everything. They're closer to each other in people will argue about this because there's also a division you can make about the dual pairs in the quadras, but I think it's less useful. I think the more useful division is to say there's a gamma extrovert type, which is a subtype of gamma, and there's a gamma introvert type, and then there are subtypes of those types.
Okay.
And this is true for all of the other quadras.
So
the gamma introverts emphasize the introverted elements in gamma, and the gamma extroverts emphasize the extroverted elements in gamma, and are relatively weak in the other two. Of course, this is not true because the creative function is manifest much more consciously than the ignoring function. Is that right? No, the suggestive function, sorry, which is the other quadra value. Where the suggestive function is really much more below the surface, and the creative function isn't always below the surface. But broadly speaking, these types share an archetype, where this is the only major difference between the way that the functions are expressed is that functions 1 and 6 are expressed in a very similar way, Functions 3 and 8 are expressed in a very similar way as partially valued and sometimes used. And functions 4 and 7 are expressed very similarly as blind spots. And 2 and 5 are not always expressed the same way, but I think often both of them are somewhat under the surface. And so these are the closest distinctions. The most difficult typing problem that you'll have to find is when you're thinking about a person and you know that they're a beta extrovert, but you don't know which one, and so on. And these comparisons can get very nuanced. They can be very difficult, and it's hard to get them right. And I'm sure that I've gotten them wrong a whole lot. So some people I would say understand that nuance of quadra values, and some people don't. But your question is, you asked what are some things that people don't understand in general? Well, it depends on your level of knowledge. Some people may understand those things. Some people may not understand those things. Some people probably think I'm full of shit, and that everything that I'm saying is wrong, and that's fine. Some people are entitled to their own opinions.
Right. Yeah, I mean, no matter who you are, there's going to be a group of people that disagree with you.
Sure.
And that's the politics of socionics. Everybody wants to be right.
I want to be right. I don't necessarily care very much about whether other people always agree with me.
Yeah. I would say try to learn from as many people as you can. And if you find discrepancies with how they practice, then you don't either look for where those discrepancies don't work, or you kind of move on and get over it, basically. Okay, so I'm going to look through my notes and see if there's anything else specifically that I wanted to ask. Is there anything that you could elaborate on more with the quadra values?
See, it helps to quadra values is a very extensive topic, and it's a very important topic. It's a little helpful if you have something more specific to ask about.
Let me take a look. Well, I'm going to reiterate the last answer that you gave me, and that is that the extroverts and introverts within each quadra express their IMEs similarly, and that is that the introverts express the introverted functions similarly, and then the extroverts express the extroverted functions similarly. Is that what you said?
Yes, I said it in a little more detail. Yeah. So if you think about the expressions of functions in Model A, functions 1 and 6, right? The base and the mobilizing function. These functions are both always on. The mobilizing function is classically thought of as stubborn. The hidden agenda, which is something of a misnomer, but it's underscores that it's a point of conscious focus, which it is. You can think of these functions as always on. The hidden event, the mobilizing function is. This is true of both of the superid functions. Is that these are sore points. The subjective function is a more sore point, but these are level up functions, as you could say. At some point in life, you level them up, and then you can access them. And you can see, especially with the mobilizing function, sometimes there are very young people who are insensitive to the mobilizing function.
Yeah.
Most people, I think, are not that insensitive to the mobilizing function. For most people, it's already leveled up, at least to some extent. And it does appear similarly to the base function. The suggestive function is much more difficult to level up, and is sort of a more like a lifelong process of leveling it up. But it's in a way more deeply stubborn than the mobilizing function for that exact reason. It's more of a sore spot. So functions 1 and 6 look similarly. Functions 3 and 8 are these partially valued functions that are things that you do sometimes. They're not part of your quadra values, but you still do them. They can look very similarly. And so, right, the activators, right, 2 gamma extroverts, SE and ILE, they have T and SE as the extroverted gamma functions. One of them is in the base function, one of them is in the mobilizing function. Same thing with 3 and 8, right? These types have that function swapped. The vulnerable function and the ignoring function are two blind spots. That's the way I see those functions. Is they're both blind spots. So the SE and LIE have SI in one and TI in the other, depending on which one, and they act basically the same. The only of these, in my view of Model A, the only of these functions that they share that look somewhat differently are the creative and the mobilizing function, where one of them has NI and the other has FI. The creative and suggestive function look a little different, but they can look the same in the sense that they are subdued to a point.
The creative and the mobilizing?
So the creative and the suggestive. I think I said it wrong, but it's the creative and the suggestive.
Okay. So, so 2 and
2 and 5.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Because I've noticed whenever you look at the type profiles, when you look at the ignoring function, it almost reads pretty much exactly the same as like vulnerable sometimes. Like I was reading the other day and I noticed that. I was like, huh, it is true. Okay. If you get two people who are mirrors, I see this a lot actually. They think they can't decide which mirror they are. And from your model, that should be an easy thing.
Well, it's an easier thing than some other things. It's not, for instance, as easy a thing as if you have two. So this is something you see a lot, right? You have people who can't decide which quasi-identical they are. And that's something that's really easy. You look at quadra values, you understand which quadra you are, because those types are not at all similar. They're from opposing quadras. How could they possibly be similar? They're super similar in very superficial ways, but if you understand anything about them, they're completely different. They have completely different value systems. The mirrors don't have completely different value systems, right? They fall into the same quadra. They have, in other respects, some differences, right? They are, one of them is an extrovert and one of them is an introvert. And more so than anything else in personality theory, extrovert and introversion is something that's veridical. It's real, right? This is a scale that exists, is extremely reliable across the lifespan, even more so than the other trait scales. Extroversion and introversion is just something that's real. And often, my suspicion is that people can very often, who are beginners to socionics, that don't type themselves correctly, they just decide that they're something and then they decide that, will often correctly see themselves as introverts and extroverts because it's very easy for them to see that, and because introversion and extroversion is real. But it's neither the most obvious mistyping, nor is it the most difficult mistyping to determine between. It's up there in mistypings that are reasonable. So some of the most common mistypings, I think, are the most common one, the most difficult one to tell is activators. Also, business partners benefit can be very difficult. Then you get kindred, and probably right after that is mirrors. So you have the adjacent quadra homoverts. The activator is the same quadra homovert, the other introvert or extrovert in the same quadra, and then all of the also introverts or extroverts from either one of the adjacent quadras can sometimes be difficult. And then after that is probably the mirror.
Okay. Yeah, it seems like you see a lot of people who cannot tell whether they're introvert or extrovert. And I'm not actually talking about myself. I'm talking about like everyone when they first come into the system.
Sometimes it's a difficulty, but there are a lot of people who get it right the first time, I think.
Yeah. What would you say in socionics, what would you say the difference between introvert and extrovert is? As opposed to like the general understanding.
Right. Well, I think the general I think much is made about the difference that isn't really isn't really the most useful way of thinking about it. The most useful way of thinking about it, I think, is that introversion and extroversion is real. These are real things that I agree that some people are ambiverted and it's more difficult for them to really pin that down. Also, some people are not ambiverted, they're just confused. But broadly speaking, more so than anything else, it's real. So it doesn't matter what a precise definition you use to define it. That said, the way that I would define it is a very information metabolism centric way of defining it, which is that extroverts are primarily attuned to exterior information, exterior space information, and introverts are primarily attuned to inferior space information.
Okay. Yeah, that makes plenty of sense. So you really couldn't really have a definition of it, only because it's going to really vary between each type, because it's going to
what do you mean? That is a definition. What's wrong with the definition I just gave? It's a perfectly good definition.
Okay.
It's an abstract definition that relies on the interpretation of this abstract idea, but that is the definition that has always been the definition of what it means in socionics. In fact, that is the definition of introversion and extroversion that Jung essentially gave. He wasn't talking about information metabolism, strictly speaking, although I think what he said is very similar mostly, and that much is made of the differences between information metabolism and information processing. But that's essentially how Carl Jung defined introversion and extroversion is. The orientation of the dominant psychic function, to use his language. He wasn't talking about social extroversion, although he probably did see it as essentially the same thing.
Yes. All right. I think that we should probably end this, only because it's been going on for a while now. I'm sure there's plenty of other stuff that we could talk about, but all right, yeah, we can end it here. Is there anything else that you would add? Basics of understanding socionics, or anything that you add to it?
I have difficulty with that question. That's why I ask for specific questions, because explain socionics is a very vague question, and so hopefully there were some specific questions that I answered inadvertently. I think there were. Yes.
No, I'm definitely satisfied. I mean, there's only so much you can talk about in one period, and there's just so much to talk about when it comes to socionics. You really can't. Yeah, it's a huge subject. So, all right. Well, I appreciate your time.
Yep.
All right.